It is a huge privilege for me to be able to address you all as potentially, as I'm kind of acutely aware, maybe the youngest person in the room. So I was lovely approached by Realize, the company that is organizing this in collaboration with the wonderful Conduit, as a member of Generation Z. Of course, environmentalism is an issue that is instinctly and inherently intergenerational. What is specific, though, is that perhaps my generation, the millennials above me, and the Gen A, very scary that they now exist, are going to be most confronted by these issues. That is not to say, however, that other generations should not immediately be making these calls to actions. And that's exactly what this event is intended to do. It is to be a call to action. It is to see how you can potentially reinvent your life and do more things in an environmental space. And for that, we are immediately grateful for all of you coming. So, without further ado, because I'm certainly not nearly as much of an authority as our wonderful speakers here, I'm going to go ahead and introduce the incredible people that we have on our panel. So, first of all, beginning with Anne. Anne has led perhaps one of the most inspiring and exciting careers that I've really ever heard of. The King actually described her as the most accomplished British female explorer. Across 10 Arctic trips, numerous world records, and I imagine several broken skis, Anne has traveled to the North and South Pole and has really witnessed firsthand the extent to which our ice and the Arctic is degrading. Anne is not a voice so much for the people of the Arctic, but is a voice for the massively underrepresented ecosystem that is the Arctic and the Antarctic. A voice for the ice, if you will, and we really, really need to hear a much louder voice in this space. Sir David, who was the chief scientific officer for the UK from 2000 to 2007, has an extensive CV that I could, I'm sure, fill the entire time of this by talking about. He was the chair and founded the Centre for Climate Repair and was the permanent special representative for climate change from 2013 to 2017. Simon, in the middle, led the UK delegation to COP26. He is a senior fellow at the World Resources Institute. He is he was formerly head of the private office to Minister of State for Energy and Climate Change. He is perhaps one of the world's leading authorities on the policies that surround environmentalism. So without further ado, that I ask Anne to potentially introduce herself a little bit further and tell us about maybe some of the hard realities that you endured during your time in the Arctic.
Thank you. What a wonderful introduction. I'm not sure how I can follow my own introduction. I have had the absolute honour of being up on the Arctic Ocean since 1997 to 2019, which was the last time any expeditions were up there, for many reasons, geopolitical, but also the ice is disappearing up in both polar regions, as well as other places on this earth. I was educated until the grand age of 15, so I don't propose that I have an intelligence of everything that we can do, but what I do have is a passion for the ice that I've seen and what is happening. And I have been educated throughout my life on what's happening with the world, as you all have, probably to a further degree than myself. And what I've seen in the Arctic is, in 1997, when I first went there, there was masses of multi-year ice over 3 years old, where it didn't melt in the summer, kept growing in the winter, over 3 years, masses. We went to the North Pole on that first expedition by skiing and pulling our own sledge. And I kept going. I have worked with scientists up there, and I've worked with wonderful institutions such as NASA. But as the years have gone on, I have seen the ice disappear. So much so that in 2002, I was part of an expedition that went from land to the North Pole. We would not have made it if we hadn't swam in the water. It would not have happened. And every year that I've gone up there, we've swum more and more. And that's just a very personal, basic view. But what really got me is what that means to the ocean, the peoples there. I don't speak on their behalf, but I have an intelligence of how it affects them, the marine life. As the ice is disappearing because of how the world lives, not because of anything happening up there, because of how the world lives, the ice is disappearing, that is wrecking the ecosystem up there. That in turn, because all our oceans are connected, is affecting the whole of the planet. And I don't want to talk about the peoples, it's the planet. And that's why we now talk about climate change. When I first heard about it, it was global warming. It's actually the change around the planet, the potential slowing of the belt that drives our oceans, the potential change in ocean acidification, because we put more CO2 into the ocean, it's not coping the same. The potential change in all our waters, because as the ice melts on land, it adds more fresh water. So because I've worked with people who are educated and who are scientists, and I've collected and they've shared their knowledge, that's the only reason I know is because they've shared their knowledge and helped me to understand. I have some understanding of the world. And because I've been up there and I now have witnessed it, I feel passionate. And I think it's within all our capabilities, the masses, we all have a responsibility to do something. And so I look to people who have answers and to help me understand how I can help and how I can spread the world. I spread the word, not the world. I speak for a living. Can I talk? Can I spread words? And it's helpful for me to be here and learn as we all do throughout our lives. So hopefully I'm here as a witness and can add something along the evening.
Wonderful. Thank you, Anne. I'm sure we all are deeply impressed by your fortitude, and the sheer idea of swimming through the Arctic is something that not many of us would probably like to go ahead and do. Simon, would you like to talk a little bit more about your career, the focus of your research, and yeah.
Well, there's no way I can make my career sound as exciting as Anne's, so I'm not going to try. But
Probably
talking about
valuable.
ice reminds me of about 10 years ago when Dave and I were working together on climate change risk assessment and trying to figure out how bad things were. One of the most worried scientists that I ever spoke to was a guy at Cambridge University who used to go in Russian submarines and go down below the ice in the Arctic. And he was more worried because he said everybody else is just looking down from satellites and seeing their area reducing, but I'm going underneath it and seeing the thickness reducing. And it's the volume you need to really worry about, not the area. And just thinking of that, I suppose, how do I explain what I do? Well, in the same way that he was down below the ice looking up at it, I've been sort of looking up at the dirty underbelly of policy making and diplomacy on climate change for the last 10 years or so. And a few things that bugged me enormously over that time. One was utter failure to communicate to the heads of government the extent of the risk. You would think that's the bit that we do well, but we don't. We really failed to do that well. When I say we, I mean the climate change community, and including within that, the climate science community, which has told us everything that we do know about it, and so we should be enormously grateful to them. But we can come on to that. The second thing is, when governments make policy, they very often base their decisions on economics. It's not the only thing, but it's a very, very strong influence. And economics tends to be the ammunition of political battles. And yet, economists have actually, it turns out, been giving a lot of misleading advice to governments, not just getting it wrong occasionally, but systematically. And that also seemed to be a big problem. And then thirdly, the diplomacy of climate change. I think we've structured it in a way that makes it just about as difficult as we possibly could make it. So whereas it ought to be really helping us, making it easier for governments to make policies, it's not really playing that role anything like to the extent that it should do. So those are things that consistently frustrated me in government, and I was part of some initiatives to try and change each one of those three things, and eventually left and wrote a book about it so I could get it all off my chest.
Well, I hope that was a cathartic exercise for you.
It
Certainly sounds it. And necessary too, definitely. Sir Dave, would you like to continue in talking about your career and the sort of main areas which you've explored through your environmentalist lens?
Well, thank you. Our moderator has said he's probably the youngest man in this room. I can say with some certainty I'm the oldest. So I come from the opposite end of the spectrum. I was head of the chemistry department at Cambridge. The only reason I accepted the position of chief scientific advisor with Tony Blair in 2000 was because I thought I'd then have an opportunity to have an impact on the climate change policy making. So that was what drove me away from a wonderfully comfortable job in Cambridge to go into the kind of atmosphere that Simon has just been describing. I mean, let me add to what Simon said. Quite soon into my career with Tony Blair, after the foot and mouth disease epidemic, when I suddenly was in front of him every day, literally, I said climate change is the biggest challenge. I gave him a detailed briefing, and then he backed me. And so then we had a G8 meeting in which he was the president in 2005. And I'm now going to refer back to the complications of the negotiations. This wasn't even a COP meeting. This was just the G8 heads of governments. And Tony Blair agreed, let's just focus on climate change for that meeting. And we then invited other countries that weren't in the G8, major countries like Mexico and Brazil, to the meeting so that it was more representative than the pure G8. It was all very well designed. Now it goes over to people called the Sherpas, the people who meet to represent their governments to try and write up the nature of the agreement that will be reached. More than that, they actually write up the agreement before the heads of governments have met. And the American Sherpa said, I'd like all the rest of you to write up the reports, agree on what you want to say, and then send it to me. And when it came back from him, everything that meant action was redlined. The document that emerged was absolutely useless in terms of policy. And what was that about? This was George Bush Jr., and George Bush Jr. got on very well with Tony Blair. They, post 9/11, had been really forming a gang together. The power of the fossil fuel lobby. I just want to say, Obama could not sign the agreement in Copenhagen at the COP meeting there because of the power of the American fossil fuel lobby having a large number of senators and congressmen in their pockets, literally in their pockets. And so Obama couldn't get a majority from those two bodies. He couldn't sign an agreement which was top-down, telling the United States what to do, and so that no agreement was possible because the Chinese president had said he won't sign if the Americans don't sign. So I knew before we arrived in Copenhagen there couldn't be an agreement. So when we go to Paris, we change the rules, and we say each country must decide what it's going to do. So instead of telling every country what they have to do to manage this problem, which is top-down, but it's also a manageable way of proceeding, we now have this process where every country simply says, this is what we're going to do, and then doesn't even deliver on that. So we are in a very difficult negotiating position in terms of climate change. If I was still back in the year 2000, I can tell you at that point, I was quite sure that we could move away from fossil fuel usage, move away from destroying rainforests quickly, that we could get there in time. We have not managed that on anything like the scale that is needed. I don't want to be sounding too pessimistic, because we've actually done quite well. Here in the British government, we introduced, before any other countries, a demand on utilities to expect what percentage of renewables they would produce onto the grid year on year, with that percentage increasing. And the utilities had no choice. They had to follow that through. This was a full regulatory system to drive it through. At that point, Simon could actually give the numbers because his book covers this. I would say renewables were 30 to 50 times more expensive than they are today. So the public was being asked to pay for that. But the increased volume in production, and this is actually Simon's point, the increased volume in production to meet this regulatory system, and the other countries in Europe joined in, California joined in later on, meant that the price kept falling. And so today, it is competitive for almost every country in the world to put renewable energy onto the grid. So we've seen a remarkable increase, as the IEA has shown, the International Energy Agency has shown, we've seen a remarkable increase in renewable penetration into electricity production around the world. 30%, I think, is the latest figure. So while we are really rightly criticizing that we haven't done enough, I would say yes, but a lot of us were doing quite a bit. But for some reason or another, there's no global leadership around at the moment. Can I pick up on what Anne was saying? I spoke to, not Anne, but another polar explorer in 2003. He came to see me and he told me your story. Walking to the North Pole was no longer possible. You had to swim a good part of the way. And this was in contradiction to what many of the climate scientists at that time were saying. So there was a marked contradiction between those who were actually experiencing what was happening. We now know that the Arctic Circle region as a whole is heating up at 4 times the rate of the rest of the planet. When did this start? About 2000, when these blue water pools were appearing in the Arctic Circle region. And those blue water pools soak up sunshine very effectively. The white ice reflects it back into space. And so what you get is this amazing transformation in the Arctic Circle region. So quickly, let me just say, this is challenging the whole world. First of all, Greenland has enough ice that when it all melts, sea levels would rise by 7.5 meters, 24 feet. Global average. We certainly wouldn't be sitting here very comfortably at that point. Right, so what we're talking about is a challenge to the whole planet. Way before that, 1 or 2 meters is a big challenge to many, many cities sitting on coastlines where most of our cities are around the world. 7.5 meters, unimaginable. Move to the permafrost region, the land-based region around the North Pole, around the Arctic Sea, and we see that there is now explosive release of methane, leaving large craters in the permafrost. Large, 50 meters diameter, 60 meters deep, that's typical. About 1,000 to 2,000 of these explosive releases have occurred. Again, climate science didn't predict this, very difficult to predict, but certainly methane hydrates decompose as they approach the ice, melting point of ice. And so this is what's happening there. There's enough methane there, if it was all released in a period of 20 years, 2 decades, global temperatures would rise by 5 to 8 degrees centigrade average. So sea level rise, and what I'm talking about now, the temperature rise, would just be so challenging to us in terms of humanity. And I'm talking about, in 30 years' time, the land mass of Vietnam, 80% to 90% under seawater at least once a year, in just 30 years' time. If we look at Indonesia, Jakarta, the northern part of the city is today under seawater, the northern part of Jakarta right through the year. So what we're looking at with these challenges is global. What are we experiencing? And this is my last point. What we are experiencing today is the effects of the change in the wind that blows around the North Pole in an anti-clockwise direction, the jet stream. This wind is determined by the rotation of the Earth. It's not going to slow down. But what is happening, if you have warm air over the North Pole region, which it now is, and how warm? It's very warm, during the polar 3 months of summer, that warm air is pushing the cold air that is normally kept in the Arctic Circle by that anti-clockwise wind. That cold air is pushing that wind into being completely non-circular. So it's bending down as this cold air gets pushed down, and then warm air comes up to replace it from the equatorial region. These extreme weather events we're experiencing around the world are driven by what I'm telling you now. So we've got massive challenges, which means that we have to reevaluate what we have to do to manage a safe future for humanity. I'm going to leave it at that. I'm happy to come back and say how I think we should manage that.
Definitely. I think the constructive conversation is hopefully a positive output that we can all walk away from here with. So, David, you've given us lots of areas of cynicism there. You pointed to lots of things going wrong, huge areas where we need to change policy and to really double down. So to Simon, I ask you, how are we doing on the global scale of governance? David's identified we're lacking a global leader taking a real strong stance on climate change. How are we doing in the fragmented sense that we maybe see environmental policy playing out?
Well, I think nobody would argue that we're not off track. And, you know, I expect everybody knows there was this report that came out in September from the United Nations, the Global Stocktake, as it was called, and it said we're off track. And the global response is, yeah, we know. We've had reports telling us that every year for the last 30 years, if not more. So that's not controversial to say. I suppose the bigger area of debate is when you look at how are we doing in those parts of the economy where we have actually done something, primarily the power sector and second, road transport. And actually in those two areas, we're doing quite well. And how well you think we're doing depends on how you play with the numbers. If you say, well, we're deployed 100 gigawatts of solar power globally last year, and let's assume we do the same thing every year from now for the rest of this decade, then you still say, oh, we're really far off track. But if you actually say, no, what's happening there is exponential growth, and it's doubling over a constant period, and you project forward that constant doubling rate, then you actually say, oh, solar power is more or less on track for a 1.5 degree consistent pathway. And the same for electric vehicles. You actually see that's pretty much on track. Neither of those things mean that there aren't still really difficult problems to solve in those two sectors. But it does show that when you have the right kind of policies, actually you can get extremely fast progress. So there's a general point that I'm concerned with, and I alluded to it earlier, but I'm coming back to it, the point about economics. There's a certain amount of political will on climate change. We would like there to be more, and some people's efforts are focused on trying to increase the amount of political will on climate change. But there's also an important thing, which is to take whatever political will there is and focus it in the right places. Focus it effectively so that it drives rapid change. And the reason I say economics has not helped us do that is a lot of the advice has said the most efficient thing you can do is price carbon, the polluter pays principle, as if all we're trying to do is pay somebody to take out the bins. Whereas actually what we're trying to do is achieve the most rapid structural change in the global economy deliberately that humanity has ever attempted. That is a different kind of problem. It's not a problem of allocation of fixed resources across the economy. It's a problem of creation of new resources. And so it involves a completely different logic. And when you look back at all the technology transitions of the past, of which there have been many, and we can see the patterns in them, absolutely none of them was achieved just by taxing the old thing. We didn't go from horses to cars by taxing horse shit. We didn't go from not having the internet to having the internet by taxing letter writing. We didn't create a civil aviation industry by taxing ground transport. You know, you can apply that. It's facetious, but it's true. In all of these examples, the transition happened because people invested in the new technologies and the new system. the infrastructure and the institutions that fit around those new technologies and help them grow. And the reason that works so well is they benefit from these amplifying feedbacks. Just like the climate system has the dangerous amplifying feedbacks, like when you lose the sea ice and the sea absorbs more heat and it warms up and it melts more sea ice, you get those amplifying feedbacks in the economy as well. But in the technology transitions, those feedbacks are our friends. When you invest directly in the new technology, it benefits from economies of scale, learning by doing, and all the rest. The more you make it, the better it gets and the cheaper it gets. So that is the way to bring about fast change. So if we take what we see has worked in the power sector and road transport and apply that to all of the other sectors and say, for goodness sake, don't waste time with carbon markets and believing that's the most efficient way to achieve it. Instead, first invest in the new solution, create it, scale it up, then regulate to apply it quickly across the whole economy. That's the way we can make the best use of the political will that we have.
Okay. Thank you very much. And I think it really speaks to the need to sort of expedite all of the goals that we have. Net zero is something, a term that we hear spoken about so often. We're almost net zero washed. And I suppose a question that I asked to you, Anne, is do you think net zero goes far enough? Do you think that actually we need to be looking at changing a public consciousness about actually putting the planet first before sort of humanity and all of the economic decisions that are potentially influencing all of our climate policy?
The answer is yes, but I also want to, if you will, just pick up on a few things that you said. And I think you're absolutely right, and I hadn't thought about it that way, that actually taxing things doesn't change where we need to invest. But I think what struck me when you said that is where we are taxed as humanity, green tax on flying or all those things, what always annoys me as a human being and really surprises me is the money that we are paying that tax is then not invested. It's gone off for other reasons, and I think I've always found that extraordinary, that where we are taxed for absolute green things, that money is not put to invest in sustainable things, and that horrifies me, that even those basic things where it might not be the best way, we could use that tax for better ways than we are doing. So I just kind of wanted to add that to my own thoughts of that. But no, I don't think net zero is the only way. It just isn't, because there is so much happening already. We've already, as Dave was talking about, there are methane explosions. There's things happening that net zero is not going to solve that. And so I've been really lucky, always tagging on to other people's things, is I've been spoken to Realise, who are thinking of solutions. So it's not just about net zero, but actually how can we reverse or change, or you use the term, I'm trying to remember, biomimicry. Is there something that we can do actually that will help either give us time or change how we do things, not just for net zero, but to make a real difference? And I don't think it is enough. I think we have to look at doing something else. And coming back to you, that possibly, potentially is invest in that doing something else. Let's not just look at how can we stop emissioning, or how can we solve it. How can we really make that change and invest? And how can we persuade our institutions, our governments, our global communities to do that? That, I think, is something that needs working on and that we can all work towards.
Absolutely. So in terms then of finding some positivity perhaps, what innovations can we take? So you mentioned biomimicry, and this fits into the sort of larger theme of geoengineering and geomimicry as well that also exists. I wondered, Dave, if you could provide us with a bit of context on what each of these terms mean and their implications for modern environmentalism.
I'm going to come to that after I make a brief statement. The Climate Crisis Advisory Group that I chair, which is an international group of 16 people from 11 countries, each of them a climate science leader, we've come up with what we call the strategy for managing a safe future for humanity. This is a comprehensive strategy. It's a 4R strategy. And so the first R is reduce emissions deeply and rapidly. We're emitting 50 billion tons a year today. 40 billion of that is carbon dioxide, the rest is methane. We need to bring that down, and I'm now saying beyond net zero. Net zero is a curious statement. It doesn't tell you how much you've got to reduce emissions by. So I'm going to say we've got to reduce emissions by something like 90% compared with where we are today to have a manageable future. So moving on from the reduce comes remove. Because of what's happening in the Arctic Circle region, we've already got to the point where we're not at 1.5 degrees centigrade yet. By the way, where are we? 10-year average, 1.15 over the last year, above the pre-industrial level. But this year, from January to October, the official figure is 1.43. And this is the effect of El Nino coming through. Next year, I would say almost certainly we'll be above 1.5. But for me, the obvious thing is what's happening in the Arctic Circle region tells us there's already too much greenhouse gas up there. We're at over 500 parts per million if we include, as we should, the methane contribution. I believe we need to bring that down to 350 parts per million to create a manageable future. If we can look back 5,000 years, why would we be happy if we can only look forward for 50 years, which at the moment is the sort of figure that we're looking at? So I think we need to look very, very carefully at all the possibilities, and maybe we should discuss these, for removing vast amounts of greenhouse gas that we've already put up there. If I then come to my third R, it is what Anne has described as buying time by, in some way, keeping the ice that is formed over the Arctic Sea during the polar winter, keeping it there during the summer. It's only a thin layer now, and within a few days of the Arctic summer coming back, that thin layer disappears. It melts very quickly. So we need to learn how to reflect sunlight away from the whole of the Arctic Sea region. And what a group of us are doing is seeing if we can learn how to put white cloud cover over that region for the 3 polar summer months. That's one possibility, and we've already mentioned the business of growing more ice, which is relatively easy during the winter period, growing more ice by pumping seawater onto the ice that is already there. We know several different techniques for managing this, but the fourth R is resilience, and resilience is needed throughout the planet. In every part of the world, we can go up to the North Pole region, the Sami and the Inuit. People have acclimatized themselves probably over thousands of years to living on the ice. We're all acclimatized to our local climate. Local climates are in transition right now, and we all need to be building in resilience to those changes. New York was hit by Hurricane Sandy in 2012. It was badly flooded. Of course, the hurricane warning came through early. Everyone either went up to higher levels, etc. No lives lost, but there's massive loss and damage in the city. What is the city doing about managing future floods? And the answer is the city, and we've produced a report on the major cities of the world and what they're doing. The city brought in the American Army Corps of Engineers, which is a very good group of civil engineers, to design how to produce a future for the city as sea levels rise. And they produced a report after 4 years. It cost quite a bit to produce. So by 2016, the city had the report. And the report says, build a wall around the city, which is minimum 8 feet high in one area, up to 20 feet high in much of the area. And the city decided that they didn't want a wall around the city. Now, I'm afraid This is the response around the world. We went into the mayor's office, and the mayor's office was saying, no, we are looking at all the alternatives. Now, what is the alternative to rising sea levels other than building a wall? It's quite a big challenge. I'm saying to you, there's no place in the world that has a good strategy for moving forward. The Dutch, of course, are more advanced than others. They claim to have a strategy that puts up with a 2-meter sea level rise. Now, there's no other country with anything like that sort of strategy. So I'm saying we need a hell of a lot more to be doing. Now, your question was about the terminology being used. What I'm describing as the work that I'm focusing on, and it's several different strands, it's always what I call biomimicry. This is examining what's happening in nature. How are white clouds formed over the ocean? We look at that and then say we're going to imitate that by encouraging that formation to get white cloud cover over the Arctic Sea. So we're using natural processes. So I could go on and list these biomimicry processes. Geoengineering, I can give you one example where I think the geoengineering is a good term, and that is to put mirrors in space at the so-called Lagrange point, which is the point where the gravity of the Earth and the gravity of the Sun cancel each other. And if you put an object in space there, as the Earth moves around the Sun, that object stays in that place. So you put a couple of mirrors up there. The mirrors have to be enormous to deflect sun away from the Earth. That's geoengineering. Right? There's no way that is imitating a natural process. So I think, otherwise I worry about the term being used as a pejorative term. What were the other terms you asked me about?
So you've covered 2 of the 3 very diligently. It was geomimicry that was going to be the final term.
Geomimicry is also biomimicry. I was just extending it into the geological systems.
There we go. Wonderful. Thank you very much for that comprehensive answer. So these are complex terms, naturally, and I think a lot of us day to day are faced by a huge swathe of environmental information or potential innovations, new policies, that we're left often with a lot of indecision about how we can actually sort of invest ourselves in them, and what might be the best potential route. So to Simon ask, you mentioned about the struggles in actually communicating the severities of the issue to prime ministers, both in the private sense of influencing people at the top in clear communications from the scientists, and in a sense of sort of communicating clearly to the public the real severity of the issue. What practical steps do you think we can make to make environmentalism just more accessible and easily understood?
Okay, well, for me, I think the answer to that question comes down to the difference between prediction and risk assessment. A prediction is where you say what's most likely to happen, and then after that you might ask, does it affect us in a way that we care about? Risk assessment is where you start by saying what could happen that we would really care about, what's the worst that could happen, and then you might ask, well, how likely is that? So they're similar questions but asked the opposite way round, and it's not just a presentational thing, it's not a framing device. The order in which you ask those questions produces different information. So for example, if you're talking about sea level rise, as Dave was just now, then typically the information communicated to governments goes along like, well, our prediction for this century is that sea level rise will be somewhere between 0.5 meter and 1 meter, and there's an uncertainty band. To which the average government minister's response is, oh, so what? And then you might get some prediction of, well, the economic damages from that will be this much GDP. And again, the response will probably be, so what? And we don't really believe it anyway, because it's just come out of a model with loads of random arbitrary assumptions in it. But if you take the risk assessment approach instead, then you might say, for example, well, what is the limit of sea level rise that London can protect itself against? And there's one study that's asked that question and come up with a kind of estimate. And it said, well, you know, with 1 meter, we can probably make do with the Thames barrier, maybe build it a bit higher. go out to 3 meters of global sea level rise, we'd have to build a whole new Thames barrier, much bigger than the first one, further out to sea, and massive coastal defences all the way along the Thames estuary. Go up to 5 meters, and you're on to actually what Dave was just talking about. The only way then that you could possibly protect London, or the centre of London, would be building a wall all around the centre of the city, and then, oh bugger, we've got the River Thames, so we have to pump that over the top of the wall. And once you get to that point, then you realise the cost, the difficulty, and the residual risk, what happens if it actually does overtop the wall, are all so high that it's really not worth it, and you just move your capital to somewhere else instead. I usually say Birmingham at that point, but then I gave a talk in Birmingham, and I thought I'd better stop saying that. But then you can ask, well, how likely is that? 5 meters of global sea level rise. And one answer to that is, well, actually, look at the IPCC's 5th assessment report 10 years ago, dig down about 2,000 pages into the report, far, far, far away from the summary for policymakers, and you find that long-term committed sea level rise for a temperature rise of 2 degrees is about 10 meters, double London's limit of adaptation. But how long, when that might happen, nobody knows. Actually, in the most recent IPCC report, the 6th assessment report, they did something very helpful, which was they included in the summary for policymakers an outline of a plausible worst-case scenario for global sea level rise. That was extremely helpful. It's deeply uncertain, so I'm sure the scientists were really uncomfortable in doing it, but I'm grateful to them that they did, because it shows 5 meters could be hit by 2150. So that's in just over a century. And as Dave was saying, you can look past, you can look forward, you can look back and say, well, London was founded by the Romans, if not people before. It's had a history of at least 2,000 years. Is its future only going to be 200 years? That would seem a bit of a shame. When you look at it that way, the risk is much clearer than when you just have a prediction that says 0.5 meter to 1 meter. And you can apply that same switch in perspective to every single one of the climate risks that you might consider. So I think that's an approach that is very necessary. It would help in public communications, but even more importantly, from my point of view, it would help heads of government be in absolutely no doubt about the extent of the risk that they face.
Yeah, absolutely. And if we are to make these practical steps and reevaluate how we communicate environmental policy and necessary innovation, there's a very human question that I think needs to be asked, is as we do make progress, as we do innovate and actually start to make headway with this in a meaningful sense, how do we stop complacency amongst the population? There is a common view that humanity will always sort it out. We see that with AI, with the development of hundreds of new technologies that have happened in the past. How then can we be sure that once the ball is rolling and rolling properly, that it doesn't stop?
I think a lot of keeping it going is everybody talking about it, everybody investing about it. And I just want to share a small story. And it's not about coffee cups. It's not about coffee cups. Yes, we should stop reusable coffee cups. I hope that's a real thing, and we all believe it now. I speak a lot, and when I give a conversation, whatever it's about, I'll say, all companies now are talking about sustainability. So I will say, could I mention something about sustainability at the end or whatever, because I think it's about conversation. And I went to an event, it was a leadership event, and it was a hotel that had proper cups everywhere. But when you went to the conference room, it was paper cups. So I spoke about it to the audience, and I said, we all have a responsibility and we have to hurt people in their pockets. And I said, we've all come in here and we're all very happily using these disposable cups. I went, could you imagine if everybody here, because they've got proper cups, I've seen them, I've got one, I'm not using those, if we all went to them and said, I'm sorry, but we're not prepared to use them, then it will hurt them, because if people demand it. And this woman walks out. I thought, oh, gosh, I'm always going to upset somebody. And anyway, the break was after me. By the time we left, she had got them to remove every coffee cup and put in normal cups. And it's not about the cups. It's about the more that we keep remembering to spread the word, to keep saying it, to voice it, to actually have passion about it, then I think we can keep it rolling, and it's up to all of us. And to think of new ways. I had a conversation with and I'm not perfect. I'm just, I left school at 15. I just keep trying. And I had a conversation about who we're going to vote next with my husband. He went, "Who are you going to vote for?" And it's not about my, because I'm very careful not to do that, because I think that's a rabbit hole. And I went, "I'm going to vote for the Green Party." And he went, "What, you think they should run the country?" I went, "No, I don't actually, I don't. I don't think that they should run the country." I went, "But what I do want is that the next politician that gets into 10 Downing Street, there's enough people voting for the Green Party that they understand we care about it. It's not actually because I want them to be there, it's because I want the next government to understand that as a mass, we care about it." Because until we keep... If we keep just thinking it's somebody else's, it won't change. If we keep talking, we keep finding new ways. If we make it hurt them in their pockets, whether it's with votes, whether it's with buying, and we keep it going. And of course we all get a bit, gosh, we're banging on a bit too much and maybe lose our own mojo. Then look at the youth. Look at the world. Go out and walk in nature. And think about, it's not about us, and of course it'd be terrible if we all sink underwater, but it's actually about the nature. It's about the planet. We've done it to all these living creatures. Go and see them and get your motivation and get back out there and talk about it. And for me, that's hopefully what I try and do, and live by my words. It's not just words, and I'm not part of talking to governments, but I have a voice, and I'm going to let it be heard where I can. And I'll support other people that are trying and support them with my voice. I'll hopefully do it in an intelligent way. What are you doing? Do I believe in it? What are the moral dilemmas? And once I've questioned it, then if I think it's good, I'll get behind it. And that is what I think we can do as a human race. We did this, it's up to us to change it.
Absolutely. So it seems to me it's about being bold in the face of adversity and really standing up for what you believe in, regardless of whatever situational context that you find yourself in. So Dave, I can see you've been doing a lot of thinking on this and likely have some things to say. Would you like to make a response? And then, because I'm fairly conscious of everyone's time and would love for you all to get some questions of your own, we'll move to what will be my final question. And that'll be asking each and every one of you, the three of you, if you were to project a message to the world that everyone were to hear, that had to convey the severity of the message, some practical steps that we could take, some sort of call to action, what would it be?
Right. So first of all, let me just follow up on what has been said already by Simon and Anne. I think the big wake-up call at the moment is what we climate scientists we're trying to avoid needing as a wake-up call, which is the impact of climate change on different communities in different parts of the world. And by this I mean, let's go back to what I was saying about the Arctic Circle region. What are the impacts in terms of loss and damage around the world that have increased particularly over the last 5 to 10 years? And I believe the cost is likely to turn out to be, at the moment, around $250 billion of loss and damage around the world. That wasn't happening more than 5 or 10 years ago. We saw, for example, the lock-in of that jet stream up the west coast of North America in 2021. It locked in for about 2-3 weeks. Temperatures were 5 to 10 degrees centigrade above the highest previous record by human beings for that area. And right up in British Columbia, the town of Lytton, first of all, 135 people in this very respectable middle-class town died of heat stress. The temperature was 49.6 degrees centigrade, and this was way beyond anything experienced anywhere in Canada before, where people don't think air conditioning is necessary because it's quite cold in Canada, right? So What we had was deaths because people were not ready for anything like a challenge like this. But secondly, the town of Lytton was then burnt down because the local forests were dried out and then burnt down, and so did the town go. Loss and damage isn't just in the third world, but the difficulty in putting figures on this, you can get figures from the reinsurance industry, the industry that's very good at risk analysis. But that doesn't cover much of the world where insurance doesn't take place. And that's where a good part of the damage is occurring, loss and damage. So we're already seeing these amazing stresses on our system. And I would have thought this would be the best possible wake-up call. That's what amazes me about the lack of leadership globally at the moment, that we have already been experiencing what the scientific community was predicting 30, 40 years ago. So it's a bit frustrating, but I have to say at some point, these amazing loss and damage events are going to have an impact and people will step in and act. I'm an optimist.
Okay, wonderful. And just to tease one last little question out of you, Dave. Who should be taking that action? If there is this deficit in global governance, is it a state? Is it an NGO? Is it a generation? Who are the people who need to be really pioneering this effort?
I have no doubt. Let me tell you what I think needs to happen, and I've been pressing for this behind the scenes. The United States and China need to reach an agreement. I know Geoengineering in China, who was the climate envoy when I was the British climate envoy in 2015. And of course, I know John Kerry from the United States. He's the climate envoy from the United States. They need to work out a package deal, which is a doable, functional deal, but they also then need to bring the European Union in with them. They need to bring in the willing countries, and I would put Lula's presidential election in Brazil, I would put Brazil up there as one of the willing countries that they can take with this group. I wouldn't have to go for a large group of countries. I think half a dozen large countries playing this sort of leadership role is enough. And then the rest of the world will follow. What we need, in other words, is proper leadership from a small group of countries who are influential.
Okay, thank you very much. Simon, your reactions to that and your global call to action for the world?
Well, I agree a lot with the gist of what Dave was saying, that if you're talking about what happens globally, then you have to look at which countries matter for which things. And I absolutely agree the US-China relationship is more important than any other. And one of the best moments in climate diplomacy, I think, was a couple of years ago when the US and China were officially not talking to each other. And at that time, one of the Pakistani government ministers, when after their country had just suffered some really bad flooding, came out publicly and said, look, for God's sake, you two need to talk to each other. All the world needs you to work together. And it was absolutely great to hear that. One of my second best moments of climate diplomacy was at the last COP27, when also the US and China were officially not talking to each other. But they came out, and in fact, John Kerry and Xie Zhenhua joint statement made a big show of the fact that they were about to start talking to each other again. And meanwhile, the same day, I'd been to an event on the shipping transition and heard that the ports of Shanghai and Los Angeles were working together on a green shipping corridor, and no one had ever told them that they weren't supposed to be talking to each other. Or maybe they had, but they didn't care and they got on with it anyway, in the best civil service traditions that Dave and I have both been part of. So, look, what I think matters is that to decarbonize the global economy, it's not one job. It's a lot of different jobs. And the power sector is very different from agriculture, which is different from aviation and shipping and buildings and steel and cement. Each one of those is different. The interests at play are different. The challenges and the opportunities are different. And the countries that are influential with a base level of willingness are also different. So in road transport, US, China, and EU together, that's 3 bureaucracies write the rules for over half the global car market. So those 3 can really dictate the pace of the transition. They can force car manufacturers everywhere to reallocate their investment to the new technology. If you take a different sector like palm oil, for example, which is crucial to deforestation, then Indonesia and Malaysia together account for a huge share of global exports. I think it's something like 80%. So you need a different combination of countries in each sector that need to work together, and they can shift the global market. You don't need 196 countries around the table, because you do that and your lowest common denominator is as low as it can possibly be. So I suppose if you had to summarize that in a single message, it's focus diplomacy on each of the emitting sectors. Focus it on the practicalities, not the distant targets.
Okay, I think that's a massively powerful message. I would love the global system to adopt that immediately. Fairly pessimistic about it happening. So, Anne, I think that leads right on to you pretty perfectly, in that what we've seen here is a call to basically transcend national differences, national barriers for an issue that inherently trumps all of that, that confronts the entirety of humanity, not just a given nation. So on that, for you as a spokesperson for the ICE, as a spokesperson for the world, not a population, what's your message?
I think it's rather grand to say I'm a spokesperson for the world.
But for the environment, maybe, you can tone it down.
I have an opinion on the world, and it is that I have seen the ice disappear. I've seen it within the short time that I've been up there. But what's more important to me is I have understood, because I've been helped to understand, what happens when the ice disappears and the sun makes the Arctic Ocean warmer with the albedo effect, and it gets warmer and warmer and starts to melt the ice, mainly from below rather than necessarily from above. And then what that means, also because of the ice caps around, whether that's Greenland or Antarctica, as that melts and fresh water goes into these salty oceans, we have a whole host of problems in as much as the Arctic Ocean is becoming less salty. The more CO2 that we put into it, it's changing the chemistry of the ocean. I'm sure you know, but when CO2 goes into the ocean, it has a chemistry reaction. And the very minutiae of life, the very bottom, the zooplankton, relies on the natural chemistry reaction to build its bones and to build its shells. But as more CO2 is going in, that's causing effect where they're not able to do that. So it isn't just the climate change, it's the actual bottom, the very bottom of the food chain, which affects the fish, the seals, the polar bears. But then if you want to take that further, as all our oceans are connected, and as the Arctic Ocean goes on down, and it goes on through the Gulf Stream that gives us the temperate climate, and goes on down, this chemistry change in this warm water affects the belt, the rising and the falling. But it also affects the coral reefs that can't regenerate. This is not the bleaching effect. They can't regenerate the same that they were because of the change in chemistry. And scientists are working on this. But actually what that means, it comes back to the fact that these coral reefs, they protect the land and humanity against tsunamis and storms, and we've seen it. So what is happening around the world, or at the top of the world, is affecting the whole world. How we all interact, how we all change. It isn't just our local area. We are all connected. And of course it's right that the government should work, that Chinese and America should talk together. That's absolutely right. But we all should have a voice, and we all shouldn't sit back and think, okay, yep, they should do it. We all have a part to play. And that I feel quite passionate about is it's up to all of us to actually make a difference where we can, and hope and pray that the people that will make a real difference will do that too.
Thank you very much. Some seriously profound finishing words from all of you there. To the audience, I really hope that you have found some new things that you can go and share with your friends and family and spread the word of all of this, and make these global calls as well. So now we have the great opportunity of inviting some audience questions. If people just like to put hands up. Yeah, absolutely. Okay, should we go first to the gentleman here to my left? Yes, thank you.
Gentleman first, that's an original one. I'll be very quick. I know. Thank you very much indeed. I honestly feel a little leaden-hearted after this. We've all been working in this for a long time. I spend a lot of my time in schools. The purpose of that time is to give children a reason to be optimistic and a reason to be confident. I also spend time in businesses too. And I came here tonight to seek that. And I think what you've done is paint a very, very true, realistic picture. What I'm going to ask you is two things. One, what are the examples of really powerful behavior change stories that you've either been a part of or seen or heard that have actually made a difference that I and maybe we can take away with us? Because stories have been told that have made real difference, and I'd love you to share those. Secondly, more specifically, perhaps to Simon, investment in the new, not taxing the old, love that narrative. A challenge to it are subsidies. And it seems to me that I think it's about $7 trillion worth of subsidies go to the fossil fuel industry, which is UK, German economies combined. Equally, the fishing industry globally receives about 30 to 40 billion dollars worth of subsidies. So how can we, investing in the new is only going to be damaged by the government investing in the old through these subsidies. Are those changing? What's the positive story about subsidies, or do they matter at all? Those are my two questions. Thank you very much.
Okay. Simon, would you like to start us off?
Okay, yeah, and I was conscious that all three of us have talked about a bit about the risk, and as you say, I'm sure a lot of people in this room work a lot on the problem, and it shouldn't be our job to sit here and leave people feeling more grim. Look, as a story for optimism, I'll give you my best one. And I did say earlier that I think actually in both the power sector and light road transport, we're almost on track for a 1.5 degree trajectory, which is quite a surprising thing. Like, those are big parts. Those two sectors are responsible together for probably about a third of global emissions. And so not only are those two sectors actually doing quite well, but they also show us the way we can do it with all the other sectors. And probably the first ones, they might seem technologically the easiest, but politically they're the hardest, because we didn't know how to do it and we didn't have any good examples. But now governments all over the world can point to, look what's happened in the power sector, solar and wind are the cheapest thing, look at road transport, EVs are quickly becoming cheaper than petrol cars, and actually apply those lessons to all the other sectors with a great deal more confidence than they would have had 20 or 10 or even 5 years earlier. So I think that's a great source of optimism. My single most optimistic story is one that I often repeat because it's useful to know how much actions are more important than targets. And if you look at China and its approach to solar power, back in 2007, it set itself the target of deploying 1.8 gigawatts of solar power by 2020. And there was a guy called Wang Zhongying, who was head of the Energy Research Institute under the NDRC, the most powerful economic planning ministry in China. And he said, I think that 1.8 gigawatts is a little bit conservative. I reckon we could probably do 10 gigawatts. And when it got to 2020, they deployed 252 gigawatts. So that's actually what can happen when you have the right policy mix. And it wasn't because the Chinese government woke up one day and said, we need to save humanity and we really care about all those other people across the planet. Definitely not. It was, what happened was interest changed over the course of the transition. As they deployed it, it got cheaper. Their interest in deploying it for the sake of cheap electricity grew larger. Also, as they made it, they got better at making it and they sold it to the rest of the world, and their share of the global solar market went from 4% to 7%, 70% over a decade. And so the interest group in making and selling solar panels also grew. So the target quickly became irrelevant because as they went forward in the transition, the interest in pushing it further ahead grew. And that tends to be true for these technology transitions in all of these sectors. So that's where I draw my optimism from. In terms of fossil fuel subsidies, it's definitely a problem, but I think it's overstated. It's not necessarily the main thing. The reason why we hear so much about it is the same as economists bang on about carbon pricing. You know, you look at what does the IMF say? Well, for as long as it said anything about climate change, it's price carbon and eliminate fossil fuel subsidies. But pricing carbon has been irrelevant to most of the real progress that we've made. China had that astounding progress on solar, not because it priced carbon, because it invested in solar. And in the same way, the fossil fuel subsidies are often irrelevant. In the UK, the capacity market counts as a fossil fuel subsidy because we pay gas plants to stay on standby in case we need them. And the same for coal plants, although not for much longer. So that counts as a fossil fuel subsidy. But the capacity market has enabled the UK to have the fastest power sector decarbonisation in the whole world, 8 times faster than the global average over a period of a decade. So actually, don't worry about it. If you're fighting a battle, you have to look for your enemy's weak points and hit them there. Don't look for their strongest point and try and take them on there. And if you go around, you know, trying to fight Shell and BP and say, don't extract any more oil, you're attacking the enemy at their absolute strongest point, and they will push back, and you'll waste a lot of energy and not get very far. But the weak point is replace the fossil-based products in the economy with alternatives that are zero emission and better, and let people buy them, just like with the cars, and you just suck away the demand for fossil fuels, and there's nothing they can do about it.
I'm afraid we only have time for just a couple more questions. So, Josh.
Hi. Also, to Simon, a clarification on this question on investing in the old, in the new, and not taxing the old. You said something related to this about it's not a redistribution of resources, but creating new ones. And I was thinking, since we're already using more than almost 2 planets worth of resources every year, and since all the examples that you have given of successful transitions have been from post-industrial times, the types of thinking that got us here seem to lead us in a bit of a crisis. And so I'm thinking, how do you get these things to not be just technology will save us, and the way that simply enables business as usual to continue? Is this a real solution, or, as said, something that just makes the old paradigm continue?
It's a great question. Let me give a really short answer in case somebody else wants to say something. What I was alluding to was the difference between allocation of fixed resources in the economy and creating change in the economy, which doesn't necessarily mean creating more of the economy, but it means bringing different things into it and changing it structurally. It's a fundamentally different kind of problem. Technology transitions are unavoidably the core of this. You know, in every emitting sector, we have to replace the fossil fuel technologies with the zero emission technologies. If we don't do that, there's no other way to get to zero emission. That doesn't mean that it's a purely technical problem. Of course, it involves sociology, it involves politics, it involves activism and diplomacy. All of those are elements, but at the core of it, absolutely have to replace the technologies. But I think you're also pointing to the question of what kind of growth do we want? And briefly, I'd say we want growth in quality, not quantity.
Okay, can I come in? Absolutely. Very quickly on that. We'll try to be quick. I believe we are living in a period of an economic system that is dominating the whole world, which is the free market capitalist system. And I do not think in its present form it is relevant to the challenges of the 21st century. So this is a completely new topic, but I can't help saying that your question really raises this critically important investigation. So, for example, our economic system treats market failures as something which is part of the economic system. It's absurd. If you're a scientist and you have a failure in your theory, you have to throw your theory away and make a new one, right, that might be fit for purpose. We're operating in a system which gives no value to our ecosystems. And if we give no value to our ecosystems in our normal marketing process, we run consumerism for its own sake. That is how our economies are growing. Increased consumerism all the time, increased demand. That will run us short of all of these resources of the planet. We are consuming our resources. We need to take all of our common good out of that free market system. The market system, we've already been saying, can be extremely effective, but there are some areas where it's extremely damaging. And our ecosystems include, of course, the atmosphere, which we are seriously at risk of. We are forgetting that we're part of nature, not apart from nature. And that, to me, summarizes the answer to your question. It's a hell of a big challenge to try and deal with that.
I'm in possession of the microphone, so I'm going to speak. I don't think we're going to see a grand US-China bargain anytime soon, but APEC did give us a rerun of what you might call the Glasgow mini-bargain, which had a renewables target, methane and efficiency. And on industrial methane, David, I don't know if it's possible, were they to pull this off, to quantify how much time that might buy us? And for Simon, efficiency, with the enormous wasted opportunity and policy failure here in the UK is demand reduction. Our leaky, cold, damp houses, 20% of national emissions, repeated policy failure to address that. And the cheapest energy is the energy you don't use. So how can we overcome whatever the policy obstacle is to that rather obvious missed opportunity?
You carry on.
I think there was a first bit.
Industrial methane. US-China, huge quantities of industrial methane. Were they to manage to do this without the Speaker of the House visiting Taiwan and blowing the whole thing up out of the water, how much real time would that buy us? I mean, how much of a difference does it make?
I think it makes an enormous difference. I mean, of course, this is critically important. If we look at methane emissions globally, I mentioned what's happening up in the Arctic Circle region, but that's a very small amount at the moment compared with what is emitted from fossil fuel recovery. A lot of leakage still occurs from fossil fuel recovery, but I can't help saying as well from agriculture. So from consumption of beef, not a smart idea. I would encourage everyone, stop eating beef. That's a very simple way to take yourself forward into a healthier world, but also into a world where we don't have such enormous demand for meat. That really is a major contributor. If we look at the removal of forests around the world, we are driving those removals by our demands, and one of those demands is for beef. So we need to look at all of these issues, and I don't have time to go into it.
So I'll quickly respond to the second part of the question, which is about energy efficiency. And I think a lot of countries are gearing up for a joint statement at COP28 where they agree to try and triple deployment of renewables by 2030 and also double energy efficiency. The thing for me that's important is how do you work together to make those targets more likely to be achieved? Because it's all very well stating the target, but what are you actually going to do? And of course, domestically, we all know the kinds of policies that you can use. But what about diplomacy? What role does it have beyond stating a common goal? And energy efficiency is maybe one of the more difficult areas for diplomacy to be useful because it has a lot to do with building design, and you don't really trade buildings internationally. So it's far harder for diplomacy to propagate change quickly globally than it is for something like steel. But I think there's still good work that can be done by coordination on some of the relevant technologies. I mean, one thing is different ways of subsidizing clean heating. The EU's wasted an enormous amount of subsidies on biomass for heating, which is not going to help anyone. It's probably not sustainable and it's never going to get any cheaper. Whereas you could agree with other countries that you'll only subsidize genuine zero-emission heating technologies like heat pumps that do seem to have a learning curve and do come down in cost. That would be helpful. The big economies do that, they come down in cost faster, that makes it easier for all of the other countries too. The other thing is energy consuming products often are traded internationally. Often a lot of building use, energy use is used in appliances like fridges and washing machines. And those things do get traded internationally. Many countries have efficiency standards for some of those appliances. And there's no reason why you can't gang up together and say, you know what, we're going to have a really tough energy efficiency standard. We'll agree it among a small group of countries that covers a critical mass of the global market. And then anyone who really wants to make and sell a fridge is going to have to meet our standards, kick out all the inefficient ones from the global market. That's the kind of way that countries can achieve more together than they can on their own. And it's, you know, it's not completely imaginary. There are initiatives that are beginning to try to do these sorts of things. So I think the crucial thing for diplomacy, in which everybody does have a role, the media, activism, anybody, is to shift the focus. Don't let the focus just be on 2050 targets. Shift the focus onto what are you doing now and how are you working with each other to make it easier.
Okay, thank you very much. So I think that really concludes us in terms of audience questions. I'm very conscious of time, as we're already over, but I wanted to offer literally 30 seconds of closing remarks to each speaker, if that's in any way possible. Anne, would you like to start us off?
Yes, I can do it very quickly. I think we all understand that there is a need for action, that the world needs our help. It needs to change not how we do things, but how we can reverse things, give us time and actually mend the planet. And so for me, it is about the people, and we can have our collective voice to the governments, the policymakers, and to encourage and support the direct people who can directly have a voice. That for me is key.
Okay, Simon?
I'll just end by saying that when we think about what we can do individually, I would say, don't think so much about your carbon footprint. It was BP, an oil company, that did more than anybody to popularize that concept. For the same reason that car companies 100 years ago popularized ideas about safe walking and illegal crossing the road when you shouldn't do, at the same time as lobbying against seatbelts. It distracts attention from system change. So don't worry so much about your footprint, think more about your point of leverage. What can you do to contribute to system change better than most other people can do?
My simple message is, I go back to the questioner who said he was focused on young children and talking to children in schools. We have to paint an alternative, attractive future. Without that sense of optimism to pass on to younger people, and frankly, I believe the future could be much more attractive than the direction of travel we're moving in now. If we can just pay some attention to painting that much more attractive future, the air we breathe, the number of people who die. I'm one of those who suffers from asthma, and I'm sure it's because of the air that I've been breathing in cities with cars polluting the atmosphere. So I think we can paint a very much more attractive future.
Okay, thank you very much. We really are at the limits of our time now, so could I invite everyone to offer a round of applause to our exceptional speakers.